How does a place so beautiful become a prison for your soul? I'd always heard the old Cajun warnings about the bayou, that it's alive, that it watches, that it sometimes takes things. But I was a skeptic, a city kid from New Orleans who thought folklore was just a story. I learned on one terrifying night that some stories are written in the mud, and they are written in blood. This is what happened when my curiosity led me into the deep, silent water and what followed me back out. My cousin, Remy, was the one who invited me. He was born and raised in the tiny, waterlocked community of Terrebonne, a place where everyone knew the rhythms of the tide and the secrets of the swamp. He called me, his voice crackling with a strange mix of excitement and unease. "Hey, Cher," he'd said, using the local term of endearment. "You gotta see this. Old man LeBlanc's fishing boat washed up on the south bank. Engine cold, coffee still warm on the stove, but no LeBlanc. The gendarmerie, the police, they say he fell in, but he trailed off, and I could hear the unspoken words. But nobody just falls in, not here." So I drove out, the city skyline shrinking in my rearview mirror, replaced by an endless canopy of cypress and oak. The air changed too. It grew heavy, saturated with the smell of wet earth, decay, and the sweet, almost cloying scent of blooming jasmine. It was a smell that clung to the back of your throat. I met Remy at his family's weathered dock. His usual easy smile was gone, replaced by a tightness around his eyes. He just nodded toward his flat-bottomed pirogue, the kind of boat that could slide through the narrowest of waterways. "We're going to the old Thibodeau place," he said, his voice low. "That's where the boat was found. Nobody's lived out there for 50 years. The journey into the heart of the bayou was like entering another world. The main channel gave way to a labyrinth of sluggish, tea-colored waterways. The sounds of our small outboard motor seemed blasphemous, an intrusion in the profound silence. The trees grew denser, their gnarled roots clawing out of the water like the bones of some buried leviathan. The Spanish moss no longer looked picturesque, it felt like funeral shrouds. Remy cut the engine about a mile out, and we used poles to push the pirogue forward. The silence that rushed in was absolute, and it was in that silence that the bayou began to speak. It wasn't a loud sound. It was a soft, wet, squelching noise, a rhythmic shlook, shlook, like something heavy being pulled through deep mud. But it was always just around the next bend, always just out of sight. Remy's knuckles were white on his push-pole. "Les vieux parleurs," she said. "The old talkers. Grandmère used to say the mud itself has a memory. It repeats the sounds of things that have been lost or taken." I laughed it off. A nervous, brittle sound. "It's just gators, Remy, or a nutria." The sound didn't match an animal. It was too deliberate, too bipedal. We finally reached the Thibodeau property. The house was a skeleton, a ruin of gray, splintered wood sinking into the hungry water on one side. The porch was sagging, and the single window was a gaping black mouth. And there, beached on the small, muddy bank, was old man LeBlanc's boat. It was exactly as Remy had described. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the seat next to a thermos. It was chillingly normal, a snapshot of a life interrupted. As the sun began to die, bleeding orange and purple through the trees, the temperature dropped. But it wasn't just the cool of the evening, it was a deep, damp cold that seeped into our bones. The sounds of the swamp changed. The daytime frogs went silent, and a new, more sinister chorus began. The low hum of insects, the occasional plop of a fish, and that damnable schluck, schluck sound which seemed to be getting closer. We decided to stay, just for a little while longer, to see if we could find any clue the police had missed. Using our flashlights, we scanned the bank, and that's when I saw it. Not in the water, not in the boat, but in the thick, black mud leading from the water's edge toward the old house. A single set of footprints. My blood ran cold. They were barefoot, long and strangely thin, with toes that seemed too articulated. But it was the direction that was wrong. They didn't come out of the water. They went into the water and then stopped, as if whatever made them had simply submerged and never surfaced, or had walked out of the water from the other side. "Remy," I called out, my voice a shaky whisper. He came over, his flashlight beam joining mine on the prints. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he knelt down, his face ashen. "It's not bone share," he breathed. "This is not good." He pointed a trembling finger. "Look at the depth. That thing, it was heavy, and it was walking into the deep water." A sudden crack of a breaking branch echoed from the tree line behind the house. We spun around, our flashlight beams cutting frantic paths through the darkness. For a split second, I saw it, a tall, impossibly slender figure, darker than the surrounding night, standing perfectly still between two cypress trees. It had no discernible features, just a silhouette of pure blackness, and it was tall, so tall its head was level with the lower branches, and then it was gone. Not that it moved away, but that it simply wasn't there anymore. The bayou had gone completely silent. The insects, the frogs, everything. The only sound was the frantic hammering of my own heart. Remy grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "We have to go, now!" We scrambled back into the pirogue, fumbling with the pull cord for the motor. It sputtered to life on the third, agonizing pull, and Remy gunned it, pointing us back the way we came. He didn't speak. He just stared into the oppressive darkness ahead, our two flashlight beams creating a small, fragile pocket of vision. The sound of our motor was deafening, but it wasn't loud enough to drown out the new sound that started. It was a whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the water below us, from the trees above us. It wasn't one voice, but many, layered over each other, a cacophony of hushed, wet, gurgling voices. I couldn't make out words, only a sense of ancient, malevolent curiosity. Schluck, schluck. Something long and pale broke the surface of the water to our right, just at the edge of my light. It wasn't a log, it was an arm, slick with mud and algae, its fingers too long, trailing through the water before sinking back into the depths. Remy screamed, "Don't look! Just don't look!" We were racing now, the pirogue slapping hard against the water. The labyrinth of waterways that had been confusing on the way in now felt like a trap. Every turn looked the same. Were we going the right way? The whispers grew louder, more insistent, now carrying a chilling, sing-song quality. The schluck, schluck sound was keeping pace with us, moving through the trees on the bank, a shadow flitting between the trunks. Then the motor coughed. It sputtered once, twice, and died. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the whispers. We were adrift, stranded in the pitch black, the only light coming from our trembling flashlights. Remy frantically yanked the cord, but it was no use. The engine was dead, and in the sudden quiet, we heard it clearly, directly behind our boat. A slow, thick, viscous drip, followed by a soft, wet inhalation. We were too afraid to turn around. We sat there, frozen, waiting for the cold, muddy touch we were sure was coming. But it didn't. Instead,
whispers slowly faded. The frogs began to tentatively chirp again. After what felt like an eternity, Remy managed to get the motor started, and we flew out of that swamp, not stopping until we saw the distant, welcoming lights of his house. We never spoke of it again. Not really. The official report listed Old Man LeBlanc as a drowning victim. Case closed. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. A week later, I was packing my car to drive back to New Orleans. As I lifted my bag, which had been sitting in his mudroom, I noticed the bottom was caked in a thick, black, foul-smelling mud. It was the same mud from the Thibodeau Bank, and as I scraped it off with a stick, my blood ran cold for the second time that week. Pressed into the mud, as clear as a casting, was a single, long...
There are places that exist only in the hours between midnight and dawn. Liminal spaces. This is a story about one of them. A roadside diner called the Crossroads Grill, and the night I served coffee to a man who wasn't just passing through. He was already dead, and he wasn't there for a meal. He was there to deliver a message written in the frost on the window and spoken with a voice that smelled of grave dirt. I took the job at the Crossroads Grill because I needed the money and the silence. My life in the city had gotten too loud, too complicated. Out here on Route 77, the biggest event of the night was a trucker ordering the meatloaf special. The diner was a relic. Cracked red vinyl booths, a checkerboard floor that was yellowing with age, and a coffee pot that had been brewing bitterness since probably the 70s. My only company was Frank, the ancient, permanently tired cook who spent his shifts reading Western paperbacks in the back, and the occasional hum of a passing car on the wet highway. Tonight was slower than usual. A cold front had moved in, and a thin, stubborn fog clung to the ground, swallowing the tree line across the road. The clock above the grill ticked past 2:17 a.m. I was wiping down the counter for the third time, the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant clinging to the air, when the bell above the door chimed. The sound was too cheerful for the heavy silence it broke. A man walked in. He was tall and wore a long, dark coat that was beaded with moisture, though it wasn't raining. He moved with a stiff, deliberate grace, sliding into the last booth in the corner, the one shrouded in the deepest shadow. I grabbed a menu and the coffee pot, my footsteps echoing in the empty room. "Help you?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud. He didn't look up. His hands were resting on the Formica table, pale and long-fingered. Coffee. Black. His voice was a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across pavement. It sent a minor, inexplicable chill down my spine. I poured his coffee. As I set the mug down, I noticed the temperature around his booth was noticeably colder. A draft, I told myself. Old buildings are full of them, but this cold was damp, clinging. I also caught a scent, not the smell of the damp night, but something earthier, richer. It was the smell of wet clay, of overturned soil after a hard rain. I retreated behind the counter, trying to shake the feeling. I busied myself with restocking straws, but my eyes kept drifting back to the man in the corner. He never took a sip of his coffee. He never moved. He just sat there, perfectly still, his head slightly bowed as if in prayer or deep thought. The steam from the mug rose in a single, unwavering plume, then seemed to hit an invisible cold ceiling above the table and dissipate. An hour bled by. The fog outside grew thicker, pressing against the windows like a curious, silent crowd. I decided to do a refill round, more for something to do than out of any sense of service. As I approached his booth with the coffee pot, I saw it. The window beside his table was covered in a delicate, lace-like pattern of frost. It was a cold night, but not that cold. The heater in the diner was chugging away, keeping the rest of the place warm. Yet, on that single pane of glass, ice crystals had formed, intricate and beautiful, and utterly wrong. And then I saw what was written in the frost. Not words, but a sequence of numbers, etched as if by a phantom finger. 10, 17, 23, 5, 18. They were already beginning to melt, dripping down the glass like frozen tears. My heart stuttered. I looked at the man. For the first time, he lifted his head. The shadow from his hat brim obscured his features, but I saw his mouth. It was a thin, pale line. And then he spoke again, that same desiccated whisper. "Tell her I'm sorry about the porch light." I froze, the coffee pot heavy in my hand. The words made no sense. They were mundane, domestic, but coming from him, in that voice, in this place, they felt like a line from a nightmare. "What?" I managed to stammer. "The porch light," he repeated, each word a slow, deliberate effort. "It flickers. I meant to fix it." He tilted his head slightly, and a sliver of the dim light caught his eyes. They weren't malicious. They were empty, deep, dark, and utterly hollow, like two wells leading down into nothing. A violent shudder racked my body. This wasn't a customer. This was something else. A delivery system for a message I didn't want to carry. The cold from his booth was leaching out, crawling across the floor towards me. The smell of wet earth was now overpowering, filling my nostrils, my throat. I backed away, nearly tripping over my own feet. I didn't stop until I was behind the counter, my hands gripping the formica for support. Frank poked his head out from the kitchen. "You all right, kid? You're white as a sheet." I just pointed a trembling finger towards the corner booth. Frank squinted. He looked at the booth, then back at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What about it?" he asked. I whipped my head around. The booth was empty. The man in the coat was gone. The coffee mug sat still, full, untouched. But the frost on the window was still there. The numbers 10, 17, 23, 5, 18, now melting rapidly, the water tracing dark paths down the glass. "He was just there," I insisted, my voice cracking. "The man in the coat, did you see him leave?" Frank shook his head slowly, a look of pity in his eyes. "Ain't nobody come or go for the last 2 hours, son. You're seeing things. Too many late nights." He retreated back into his kitchen, leaving me alone with the buzzing neon and my pounding heart. I couldn't let it go. The numbers, the message about the porch light, it was too specific, too bizarre to be a hallucination. After my shift, as the sun was beginning to bleach the eastern sky, I drove not home, but to the nearest town's public library and found an old phone book and started looking for obituaries from the past week. And I found him. His picture stared back at me from the local paper. A man named Arthur Bell. He had died 3 days ago from a sudden heart attack. The article mentioned he was a handyman, survived by his wife, Eleanor. And his address was 105 Oak Lane. Driven by a morbid, chilling curiosity I couldn't explain, I drove past the house. It was a small blue house with a white picket fence, and there, above the front door, was a porch light. It was flickering erratically, on and off, like a frantic, repeating signal. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I just drove, my hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. I had the message, I had the numbers, but some deliveries aren't meant to be made. Some messages are meant to be lost between worlds. I never told Eleanor Bell about her husband's apology. I never gave her the code to the lockbox. But sometimes, on foggy nights when I can't sleep, I drive, and I always seem to end up on Route 77. I slow down as I pass the Crossroads Grill, And I see him, sometimes, in that same corner booth, silhouette against the window, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally deliver his message and set him free. He's still there. He's always there. And he's still waiting.
We all know the sound of a dead channel. That empty hiss of static, the dancing gray snow on an old TV. It's the sound of nothing. At least, that's what I thought. Until I bought the vintage Zenith from a dusty estate sale. Until I learned that the static isn't empty. It's a veil. And sometimes, if you stare into it for too long, something on the other side stares back. It was a beautiful piece of furniture, a real relic. A Zenith, the Stratosphere from the 1950s, housed in a rich, dark wood cabinet. The screen was a massive, rounded dome of glass. I found it in the basement of an old Victorian house, covered by a yellowed sheet. The woman running the sale said it probably didn't work, but I was a film student, a lover of old things. I saw it as a prop, a piece of art. I handed over $80 and wrestled the heavy beast into my studio apartment. That first night, I plugged it in. The vacuum tubes inside glowed to life with a warm orange light, and a low rising hum filled the room. The screen remained dark for a moment, then erupted into the familiar chaotic dance of black and white static. The sound was a constant, soothing shh. I left it on for ambiance, the way some people leave a fireplace channel playing. It became part of my apartment's soundtrack, a white noise machine from a bygone era. But after a week, I started noticing the anomalies. It was subtle at first. I'd be grading a paper on my laptop, and out of the corner of my eye, I'd see the static coalesce. It would form a brief dark smudge in the upper left corner, a shape that almost looked like a face before dissolving back into the noise. I chalk it up to fatigue, my eyes playing tricks from staring at screens too long. Then came the voices. It started one night when I was washing dishes. Beneath the steady hiss of the static, I heard a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. Like a fingernail gently tapping on glass. I turned the water off, my ears straining. The tapping stopped. I shrugged, finished the dishes, and sat on my couch with a book. The static hummed. And then a whisper. It was so faint, so woven into the fabric of the noise that I wasn't sure I had heard it at all. It was a single, drawn-out syllable that sounded like, stay. I sat bolt upright, my book falling to the floor. I stared at the screen, my heart thudding against my ribs. The static swirled and danced, innocent and random. I held my breath, listening so hard my ears ached. For 5 minutes, there was nothing but the hiss. I was about to convince myself it was the pipes or a neighbor's TV when it came again, clearer this time, a different voice, younger, tinged with panic. Can you see me? The voice wasn't in the room. It was inside the static, emerging from the hiss like a signal fighting its way through interference. The air in my apartment grew cold. The pleasant ambient hum of the television now felt like a predatory purr. I stood up, my legs feeling weak, and walked slowly towards the set. The screen drew me in. The millions of shifting pixels seemed to form patterns, suggestions of shapes. A row of teeth, a single wide eye, a pleading hand. I reached out, my finger hovering over the power knob, and as I did, the static suddenly flared, the hiss swelling in volume for a split second, and a new voice, deep and guttural, rasped directly from the speaker. Don't! I jerked my hand back as if burned. The screen went completely black for a moment, then the static returned. Slower now, thicker, like falling ash. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the far corner of my apartment wrapped in a blanket, watching the television from a distance. It was just a screen of noise again, but it felt aware. It felt like it knew I was watching. The line between the room and what was inside the glass felt dangerously thin. The next day, I was a ghost. I unplugged the Zenith, throwing my apartment into an unnerving silence. I researched. I fell down rabbit holes about electronic voice phenomena, about theories that old televisions could act as conduits, that the static was a buffer zone between frequencies, between worlds. It all sounded like crazy nonsense in the light of day. But when the sun went down and the shadows in my apartment grew long, the memory of those whispers was more real than anything. That night, a compulsion took hold of me, a dreadful, terrifying curiosity. I had to know. I plugged the TV back in. The static bloomed to life. Its hiss was a welcome back. I sat cross-legged on the floor 2 feet from the screen, and I stared into the storm of gray. I focused past the individual dots, looking for the patterns, the faces in the clouds. For an hour, nothing. Just noise. My eyes ached. My mind started to wander. And then the center of the screen began to darken. The static pulled away, forming a perfect black circle in the middle, like a pupil dilating. And within that circle, an image began to resolve. It was my street, seen from a high angle, like from a second-story window. A car drove by. Mrs. Gable from across the street walked her poodle. It was a live feed. My breath caught in my throat. How? This was an analog set. It had no inputs, no tuner. The image flickered, and the perspective changed. It was lower now, at ground level. It was the hallway outside my apartment door. I could see the worn spot on the carpet, the chip in the baseboard. The view was shaky, unsteady, as if whoever was holding the camera was breathing heavily. The image flickered again, and this time it was the view from inside my apartment. I could see the back of my own head sitting on the floor in front of the TV. I was watching myself from behind. A cold, primal terror seized me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed, locked in this horrific feedback loop. The camera perspective began to slowly pan to the left towards my bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. The darkness beyond the door was absolute. And from that darkness, a long, pale, slender arm emerged, its fingers brushing the doorframe as it began to push the door open. A high-pitched whine, like a dying amplifier, screamed from the TV speaker. The image of my apartment dissolved back into a frantic, screaming storm of static. I scrambled backwards, kicking over a lamp, finally breaking the trance. I yanked the power cord from the wall. The silence was deafening. I was panting, sweating, tears of pure fear streaming down my face. I spent the rest of the night with every light in the apartment on, staring at the dark blank screen of the Zenith, expecting it to turn on itself. It never did. The next morning, I dragged a heavy television out to the dumpster, my body trembling with every step. I watched the garbage truck crush it into splinters and shards of glass. I felt a wave of relief. It was over. But it wasn't. Because now, in the dead of night, when the world is at its quietest, I hear it. Not from a television. I don't own one anymore. I hear it from the speakers of my laptop when it's idle, from the Davy monitor in the neighbor's apartment, from the hum of my refrigerator. It's a low, persistent hiss, buried under the silence. And sometimes if I listen too closely, I can hear the faint, desperate tap-tap-tapping trying to find its way through. The static isn't in the TV, it's in everything. And I opened a door that can never be closed.
They say you can judge a neighborhood by its silence. On Hemlock Street, the silence was perfect. It was the kind of quiet that felt earned, a reward for a life well lived. That's what I thought until the night I saw the man standing in the miller's yard. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just standing there, smiling. And that smile, it wasn't a happy smile. It was a promise. A promise that the perfect silence was about to be broken forever. It started with the dogs, or rather, it started with the dogs stopping. I was a night owl, working as a freelance graphic designer, and my most productive hours were often after midnight. I'd take a break around 2 a.m., stand on my back porch, and listen to the world sleep. The neighborhood had its nightly soundtrack, the hum of a distant highway, the rustle of raccoons in the bushes, and always, without fail, the occasional bark of a dog a few streets over. It was comforting. Then, for 3 nights in a row, the barking stopped. Not gradually, but all at once, as if a master switch had been thrown. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was thick and heavy, a physical presence. It felt watchful. On the 4th night, driven by a creeping unease, I didn't go to the porch. I went to my upstairs window, which gave me a commanding view of Hemlock Street. That's when I saw him. A man, standing motionless on the edge of the miller's perfectly manicured lawn. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark, nondescript suit that seemed to absorb the faint light from the street lamps. His posture was unnaturally straight, his arms held stiffly at his sides, and he was looking directly at the miller's house, his head tilted at a slight, curious angle. But it was his face that froze the blood in my veins. Even from this distance, I could see it clearly in the orange glow of the sodium vapor light. He was smiling. A wide, toothy, impossibly fixed grin. It wasn't an expression of joy or amusement. It was a rictus, a mask of stretched skin that didn't reach his eyes, which were just dark, shadowy pits. My first instinct was to call the police, but what would I say? There's a man smiling on a lawn. He wasn't trespassing, not really. He was just on the property line. He wasn't making a sound. I watched him for an hour. He never moved a muscle. He was a statue with a horrifying smile. Just before 3 a.m., as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked away. Not down the sidewalk, but straight across the miller's lawn, through the Hendricksons' hedge, and into the shadows between 2 houses, his movements fluid and silent. The next night, he was back. But he wasn't at the miller's. He was standing on the Hendersons' lawn, 2 houses down from me. Same dark suit, same rigid posture, same terrifying, unwavering smile aimed at their dark bedroom windows. The pattern was clear, and it was methodical. He was moving down the street, house by house. I started digging. I scoured neighborhood forums and local news sites. Nothing. This wasn't a story. It was a secret. I called my neighbor, David, a pragmatic, level-headed engineer. I told him what I'd seen, my voice shaking. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You saw him too?" David finally whispered, his voice tight with a fear I'd never heard from him before. "He was on my lawn night before last. I called the cops. They came, walked the yard, found nothing. They said it was probably a prank, but they didn't see his face. They didn't see that smile." The following night, the silence was absolute. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic. It was a vacuum. I didn't need to go to the window. I knew he was out there. I could feel it, a cold pressure against my house. I crept to my living room and peered through the blinds. He was on the lawn directly across the street. The Riley's house. He was closer than he'd ever been. I could see the details the darkness had hidden before. The suit was an old, slightly frayed wool. His hair was neatly combed, but lifeless. And that smile. I could see the individual teeth, too perfect, too white, like polished bone. He wasn't just looking at the Riley's house. As I watched, his head began to slowly, mechanically turn. The dark pits of his eyes swept over the Riley's windows, then the Johnsons', then stopped. They were fixed directly on my house, on my window, on me. The smile never wavered. It widened, if that was even possible, the skin at the corners of his mouth straining to its limit. He had seen me. He knew I was watching. I dropped the blind, my heart trying to batter its way out of my chest. I slid down the wall, pulling my knees to my chin. I was trembling uncontrollably.
I could feel his gaze through the wall, through the blinds, a cold, focused attention. I didn't dare look again. I just sat there in the dark, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing, waiting for the creak of a floorboard on my porch, the turn of a doorknob. Nothing happened. The night remained perfectly, impossibly silent. After what felt like an eternity, a faint, gray light began to seep through the blinds. Dawn. I gathered every ounce of courage I possessed and forced myself to look. The lawn across the street was empty. A wave of nauseating relief washed over me. He was gone. I didn't sleep. I spent the day in a haze of fear and exhaustion. As night fell again, the dread returned, a cold stone in my gut. I armed my security system, something I'd never bothered to do before. I checked every lock twice. He didn't come back. Not that night, not the next. For a week, Hemlock Street returned to its peaceful, quiet normal. The dog started barking again. The silence felt natural. I almost convinced myself it was over. A shared hallucination. A mass hysteria. Then, last night, I was taking out the trash. The air was cool. The stars were out. I looked across the street at the Riley's house, and I saw him. Not the smiling man. It was Mr. Riley, watering his petunias in the evening light. He saw me, gave a friendly wave, and then he smiled. It was a wide, toothy, familiar smile. It didn't reach his eyes. He held the smile for a beat too long, then turned back to his flowers. I stood there, frozen, the trash bag heavy in my hand. I looked down the street. Mrs. Henderson was getting her mail. She saw me, and her face too split into that same perfect, unwavering grin. At the end of the block, a man in a dark suit was walking his dog. He turned his head, and even from 100 yards away, I could see the brilliant white of his smile. He's gone, but he's not gone. He's in the silence. He's in the smiles. He's in the neighborhood. And I think he's just waiting for me to join them. The only house on the block that doesn't smile back when the sun goes down is mine. And I don't know how much longer that can last.
They say every house settles. It groans and creaks as the temperature changes, as the wind pushes against its bones. But the old farmhouse I inherited from my grandfather didn't just settle, it breathed. And in the dead of night, from the space beneath the kitchen floorboards, I began to hear something else breathing with it. Something that scratched, not like a rat or a raccoon. It was a slow, deliberate, patient sound. A sound that was learning the shape of the house from the inside out. The house was a sprawling, 2-century-old beast of a building at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by fields that had long gone fallow. I'd spent summers here as a kid, and the memory was all sunshine and fireflies. The reality of moving in was different. It smelled of dust, old timber, and dried lavender from the sachets my grandmother had left in every drawer decades ago. The silence was the first thing I noticed. It was a deep, country silence, so complete it felt like a physical weight. The first night I was exhausted from moving boxes. I slept like the dead. The second night, the sounds began. It was around 3 a.m., a soft, scraping noise from directly below my bedroom. Scratch, drag. Scratch, drag. I chalked it up to mice. The place was old, it was to be expected. I set traps. The next morning, the traps were unsprung, the peanut butter untouched. That night, the sound returned, but it was closer. It wasn't below me anymore, it was in the walls of the hallway, a skittering, scraping sound moving from one end of the house to the other. It was faster now, more curious. I grabbed a flashlight and walked the hallway, my heart thumping. I pressed my ear to the floral patterned wallpaper. For a moment, the sound stopped. Then, from the other side of the wall, directly against my ear, came a single, loud thump. I fell back, my flashlight clattering to the floor. I called an exterminator the next day, a jovial man named Bill, who stomped through the crawl space and attic. He found nothing. No droppings, no nests,
No entry points? Your house is tighter than a drum, son, he said, wiping sweat from his brow. Must just be the pipes or the wind. But there was no wind that night, and the sound changed again. It moved to the kitchen. This time it wasn't a skitter. It was that same slow, deliberate scratch, drag sound from the first night, but now it was accompanied by a new sound, a wet, rhythmic clicking like a tongue against the roof of a mouth. I stood frozen in my bedroom doorway, listening as it moved from under the kitchen table to the pantry and then stopped, right under the loose floorboard near the sink. I remembered that floorboard. As a kid, I'd hidden a marble under it. It was my secret. My blood went cold. How could it know? The next day, I armed myself with a crowbar and a high-powered flashlight. I wasn't looking for animals anymore. I was looking for something else. The crawlspace entrance was in the pantry, a small, rotten wooden door that smelled of damp earth and decay. I pulled it open, the hinges screaming in protest, and I was hit with a wave of cold, thick air. It smelled of wet clay, old roots, and something else, something metallic, like old blood. I shined the light inside. The beam cut through the cobweb darkness, illuminating the granite foundation stones and the hard-packed dirt floor. And that's when I saw them. Tracks. They weren't paw prints. They were long, dragging grooves, flanked on either side by deep, precise punctures, as if made by something walking on sharp, bony stilts that it had to pry out of the earth with every step. The tracks led in a slow, meandering circle around the central support pillar and then ended abruptly, directly beneath the loose kitchen floorboard. I sealed the crawlspace door with screws. I piled heavy boxes in front of it. It was a futile, desperate gesture, and I knew it. That night, the sounds didn't just come from one place. They came from everywhere at once. A frantic scraping in the walls, a wet clicking in the ceiling, and from the kitchen, that slow, patient scratch, drag sound right under the loose floorboard. I couldn't take it. I marched into the kitchen, my fear turning into a blazing, terrified rage. "What do you want?" I screamed at the floor. The house fell silent. The scratching stopped. The clicking ceased. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. I stood there, panting, listening. Then, a new sound. A soft, wet, tearing sound. And then, a single, small object was pushed up from beneath the loose floorboard, nudging it aside just enough to roll onto the kitchen floor. It was my marble, the one I'd hidden as a boy. It was covered in a thick, dark, viscous slime that smelled of the crawlspace. It wasn't a threat. It was a gift, a response. A choked sob escaped my lips. This thing, whatever it was, knew me. It had been here, living under the house all those summers ago. It had watched me. It had kept my marble, and now it was giving it back. I didn't leave. Where would I go? This was all I had. So, we've reached an inter-understanding. It doesn't scratch in the walls anymore. The clicking is quieter, more subdued. It stays mostly under the kitchen, and I can feel its presence there, a cold spot on the floor. Sometimes I wake up and find little gifts on that loose floorboard. A tarnished old coin, a bird skull picked clean, a single rare, perfect wildflower, its roots still dripping with black, grave-like soil. I never look it in the face. I don't know if it has one, but I know it's learning. I know it's listening. And last night, as I was falling asleep, I heard it. Not a scrape, not a click, but a sound that came from just on the other side of my bedroom wall. A sound made by something trying to mimic the human voice, something learning to use a throat that wasn't meant for speech. It was a single whispered word, raspy and wet, soaked in the smell of wet earth and ancient stone. Friend. And the worst part, the most chilling, bone-deep terror of it all, is that I'm starting to believe it.
There's a certain magic to late-night AM radio. The way signals bounce off the ionosphere, carrying voices and music from hundreds of miles away. It feels like a secret shared with strangers in the dark. For 6 months, I had my own show on low-watt station WZMB, Nocturnal Transmissions. But on my final night, I played a record I'd found buried in the archives. It was labeled Station ID, but it wasn't. It was a recording of something that happened here in this very building 40 years ago. And when I played it, I didn't just broadcast it over the airwaves, I reawakened it. WZMB was a relic, a concrete block building on the edge of town that smelled of dust, ozone, and old paper. I loved it. From midnight to 4 a.m., the place was mine. The world outside would fade away, and it would just be me, my listeners, and the soft electric hum of the equipment. My show was a mix of obscure jazz, psychedelic rock, and readings from weird fiction. My audience was small, a handful of insomniacs, truckers, and night owls who would call in with their own strange stories. It was my last night. The station was being sold, turning into a satellite-fed pop music feed. This was my final nocturnal transmission, and I wanted it to be special. During my break, I decided to raid the old archive closet, a tiny room packed with crumbling cardboard boxes of records and reel-to-reel tapes from the 60s and 70s. That's where I found it. A single, unmarked vinyl record in a plain white sleeve. Slipped inside was a yellowed piece of paper with 2 words typed on it: Station ID. No date, no other information. It felt like a mystery, a perfect artifact for my swan song. I placed the record on the turntable just after 2 a.m. The rain had started, a steady drumming on the station's flat roof. I queued up the mic. For all you night crawlers out there, I found something special in the vaults tonight. No one knows what this is. Let's find out together. I lowered the needle. There was a pop, a hiss of surface noise, and then silence. A long, empty stretch of silence broken only by the faint crackle of the vinyl. I was about to lift the needle thinking it was a dud when a sound emerged. It was the sound of this same control room. I could hear the same background hum, the faint hiss of the same old compressor. A voice, young and nervous, spoke. Log entry, October 31st, 1984, 2:47 a.m. This is Ben. Something's wrong with the phone lines. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a station ID. It was a personal log, a diary recorded onto vinyl. The recording continued. Ben's voice was shaky. The call started an hour ago. No one on the other end. Just breathing. And a sound. A wet, clicking sound. Like cracking knuckles, but softer. Weirder. In the background of the recording, I heard it. A faint click-pop, click-pop. A chill crawled up my spine. I could hear that same sound now, faintly, in the live room with me. I shook my head, blaming my imagination. On the record, Ben's voice dropped to a terrified whisper. It's in the walls. I can hear it moving. It's learning the shape of the building. It mimics the voices from the broadcasts. It just whispered my name using the news anchor's voice from the 6 o'clock replay. I was paralyzed, my hand frozen on the fader. I couldn't stop the broadcast. I was live. The record played on. It's at the door, Ben whispered, his voice cracking. It's scratching at the glass. It doesn't have a shape. It's just A shadow in the hallway, a cold spot. I can see my breath. As the words left the speakers, the temperature in the control room plummeted. I saw my own breath puff out in a white cloud. The gentle hum of the equipment began to falter, the lights flickering. A sharp, freezing coldness seeped from the hallway leading to the front door. And then the studio's landline phone rang. A shrill, jarring sound that made me jump out of my skin. I stared at it, my heart hammering. It rang again and again. On the record, Ben was sobbing, "The phone! Don't answer it! It's not a phone anymore, it's a mouth!" The phone on my desk fell silent, and my own cell phone, in my pocket, began to vibrate. I pulled it out with a trembling hand. The screen flashed, restricted. I rejected the call. It immediately rang again, restricted. From the hallway, I heard a new sound, a soft, staticky whisper weaving in and out of the broadcast audio still playing from the record. It was using my voice, the one I just used on the mic moments ago. "Hello? Is anyone out there?"
They told us not to swim in Blackwater Lake. The locals said it was bottomless, that it had no reflection of the moon, that things that fell in never came back up the same. We were teenagers, we laughed it off. But when my friend Leo dove in on a dare, he broke the surface tension of something far deeper than water. He came out, but he was wrong. And the thing that followed him out, the thing that now wears his face, it doesn't just mimic him, it's learning how to be him. And it's doing a better job than he ever did. It was the last weekend of summer, the air thick with humidity and the scent of pine and stagnant water. There were 5 of us: me, Leo, Chloe, Mark, and Sarah. We'd found a secluded cove on Blackwater Lake, a place where the trees grew so close they formed a canopy, casting the water in perpetual shadow. The water was dark, a brew of tea and ink, visibility ending just inches below the surface. "I dare you," Mark had said, elbowing Leo. "Dive in, touch the bottom." Leo, ever the show-off, puffed out his chest. "Old wives' tales. It's just a lake." He stripped down to his shorts, his skin pale in the gloomy light. He stood on a mossy rock, poised to dive. Chloe grabbed his arm. "Leo, don't. My granddad said, he said things live in there that don't have shadows." He just grinned. "Then I'll make some friends." The dive was perfect. He sliced into the black water with barely a splash. The silence that followed was absolute. No birds, no insects. We counted the seconds. 10, 20, a full minute. The surface of the lake became perfectly still again, a polished sheet of obsidian. My heart began to hammer. "Leo!" I called out, my voice swallowed by the trees. Just as panic was about to set in, he broke the surface, but it wasn't the explosive, gasping return we expected. He emerged slowly, smoothly, as if pushed from below. He treaded water, his back to us, his head bowed. "Leo, you idiot! You scared us!" Sarah shouted. He turned and began swimming back. His strokes were efficient, fluid, but wrong. There was no joy in them, no relief. It was the motion of a machine. When he reached the shore and stood up, water sluicing off his body, the first thing I noticed was the cold. A wave of frigid air rolled off him, raising goosebumps on my arms. The second thing I noticed was his eyes. They were Leo's eyes, the same shade of hazel, but they were empty. The usual mischievous spark was gone, replaced by a flat, analytical comb. He looked at each of us in turn, his head tilting slightly, as if cataloging. "You okay, man?" Mark asked, clapping him on the back. His skin was ice cold. "I am fine," Leo said. His voice was a monotone copy, lacking its usual cadence. "The water is deep."
He dressed slowly, methodically, his movements just a little too precise. On my hike back, he walked behind us, silent. I kept looking back. He was just watching, studying how we walked, how we laughed, how we pushed branches aside. He was a student, and we were his textbook. At Leo's house, the changes became terrifyingly clear. His dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, who adored him, took one smell of him and backed into a corner, a low growl rumbling in its throat. Leo looked at the dog, his expression one of mild, analytical curiosity, not recognition. At dinner, he used his fork and knife with perfect, unnatural etiquette. Leo, who usually shoveled food in, was cutting his pork chop into geometrically identical pieces. His mother beamed. "Look at you, so refined all of a sudden." He didn't tell a single joke. He didn't slouch, he didn't fidget. When his little sister ran in, he patted her head with the stiff, careful motion of someone who had read about affection, but never felt it. Later in his room, I confronted him. "What happened in the lake, Leo?" He was standing in front of his mirror, not looking at his reflection, but staring at me in the glass. "Nothing happened," he said, the words perfectly formed and utterly hollow. "I am Leo." "No, you're not," I whispered, my blood running cold. The real Leo would have made a stupid joke about lake monsters by now. A slow, practiced smile stretched across his face. It didn't reach his dead eyes. That is an inefficient use of energy. He turned from the mirror and took a step toward me. "You should go now. I have to assimilate." He picked up Leo's yearbook and began slowly turning the pages, memorizing the faces. I ran. I told the others. They didn't believe me. They said he was just shaken up from holding his breath for so long. But day by day, the thing that wears Leo's skin gets better. His grades have improved. He's the perfect son now. His parents are never happier. But I see it. I see the way it practices his laugh in the hallway when it thinks no one is listening. A dry, hollow sound it repeats until the pitch is perfect. I see it staring at its own hands, flexing the fingers, learning the machinery of the body it stole. Last night, I got a text from Leo's number. It read, "The assimilation is 97.3% complete. Your data profile is the most complex. You are his best friend. You are the final reference." My window faces his house. I looked out and he was standing in his own window, perfectly still, silhouetted against the light. He was looking directly at my window. He must have been standing there for hours. As I watched, he raised one hand and gave a slow, deliberate wave. A perfect imitation of Leo's lazy, friendly wave. But it was a lie. It's all a lie. The thing from Blackwater Lake is preparing to take its final exam, and I'm the last piece of the puzzle. It's almost ready to be Leo. And when it is, I don't know what happens to the rest of us. I don't know what happens to the witnesses of a perfect crime when the criminal is wearing your best friend's face.
Hospitals are places of science, of logic, of measured doses and charted vitals. I believed that, right up until my rotation on the night shift in the old wing of St. Ignatius. That's where they kept Mr. Albright, in room 307. He was comatose, had been for a decade. He never moved, never made a sound. But the other patients on the floor, they would wake up screaming. Every single night at 3:07 a.m., they would all wake up at the same time, pointing at their doors, whispering the same two words, "He's walking." And one night, I finally saw what they saw. St. Ignatius's old wing was a monument to a different era. The floors were a faded green linoleum, the walls a pale, sickly yellow. The air smelled of antiseptic, yes, but underneath it was the faint, sweet odor of decay and old varnish. I was a third-year nursing student, eager and exhausted. Being assigned to the night shift there was considered a rite of passage, a trial by fire. The senior nurses spoke about it in hushed tones. My first night, the charge nurse, Brenda, a woman with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, gave me the tour. She saved room 307 for last. "Mr. Albright," she said, her voice flat. "Catatonic, full care. Do your checks, change his lines, but be efficient." I pushed the door open. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of the hallway. Mr. Albright lay in the bed, a gaunt, pale figure against the white sheets. His face was a mask of wrinkles, his mouth slightly agape. His vitals on the monitor were a slow, steady, hypnotic rhythm. Beat, beat, beat. He looked like a statue. There was nothing remarkable about him, except for the profound, almost gravitational stillness that seemed to radiate from his bed. "Why efficient?" I asked Brenda as we walked away. She didn't look at me. Just be. It happened on my third night. I was at the nurses' station, charting. The silence of the ward was a heavy blanket. The clock on the wall ticked over to 3:07 a.m. And then the screaming started. It wasn't one scream. It was a chorus, a cacophony of pure, unadulterated terror that erupted from every room at once. I dropped my pen, my heart leaping into my throat. I ran to the nearest room, an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide with panic, finger pointed shakily at her closed door. "He's walking!" she shrieked, over and over. "He's walking!" I calmed her down, my own hands trembling. As I stepped back into the hall, I saw other nurses doing the same. Room after room, the same story. Patients awoke from deep sleep, pointing at their doors, whispering, sobbing, screaming the same phrase, "He's walking." When I asked Brenda about it at the end of the shift, she just shook her head. Night terrors, shared hysteria. It happens in geriatric wards. But her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had seen something they couldn't explain and had decided, for their own sanity, to never look directly at it again. I became obsessed. I started paying closer attention during my nightly rounds in the old wing. I noticed things. The temperature around room 307 was always a few degrees colder. The air felt thicker, harder to breathe. And sometimes, during my checks on Mr. Albright, I'd have the overwhelming, paralyzing feeling that he was not just a passive occupant of the room, but its center, that the entire wing was orbiting him. One night, determined to understand, I decided to hide. At 3:05 a.m., I slipped into the clean utility closet opposite room 307, leaving the door open a crack. The corridor was empty, silent. The second hand on my watch swept up to 3:07. The hallway lights flickered. Not a power surge, but a single deliberate dimming. And then I saw it. A shadow detached itself from the darkness of room 307's doorway. It was tall and thin, a man-shaped void that absorbed the light around it. It didn't walk so much as it glided, a slow, silent procession down the green linoleum. It was the source of the cold. A wave of frigid air preceded it, carrying that same sweet, cloying scent of decay I now associated with Mr. Albright's room. As it passed each patient's door, a soft, terrified whimper would escape from within. It was making its rounds. This was the he they were all screaming about. This shadow was Mr. Albright, or what had come out of him. I quit the nursing program the next day. I couldn't go back. I tried to forget, to write it off as a stress-induced hallucination, but the world has a way of reminding you. Months later, I was visiting a friend at a different, modern hospital across town. As I walked down a bright, sunny corridor, I felt a familiar, soul-deep chill. I turned a corner and saw a gurney being wheeled into a private room. The patient was an old man, gaunt and pale. And standing outside the room, talking to a doctor, was Brenda, my old charge nurse from St. Ignatius. Our eyes met. She looked startled, then resigned. I walked over, my mouth dry. "Brenda, what are you doing here?" She glanced at the closed door. "He transferred," she said simply, her voice hollow. "The old wing is being renovated. They moved Mr. Albright here last week." A cold dread filled me. "And the episodes?" She gave me a look that was full of a terrible, weary knowledge. "The screams started on this floor 2 nights ago, 3:07. Sharp." I looked through the small window in the door of room 414. Mr. Albright lay still, a monument to silence. But on the heart monitor, the steady rhythm was the same. Beep, beep, beep. And for a moment, I thought I saw it. A deeper darkness pooled in the corner of the room, a shadow waiting for the witching hour. It's not tied to the building. It's tied to him. He's a vessel for something that walks the night, visiting terror upon anyone who shares his walls. And now, he's in a brand new hospital with hundreds of new patients for his shadow to feed on. The infection has spread, and there is no cure.
When my grandmother passed away, she left me her old, sprawling Victorian house. The realtor called it a handyman's dream. The neighbors called it the Whisper House. And in her will, my grandmother left me one single specific instruction: never, under any circumstances, open the door in the basement. For a year, I obeyed. But a house makes sounds, and last week I started to hear something new. It wasn't the groaning of pipes or the settling of old wood. It was a sound coming from behind that door. A soft, rhythmic scratching. And then, a voice I hadn't heard in over a decade. My grandmother's voice, whispering my name, begging me to let her out. The house was a giant, silent creature filled with the ghosts of my childhood summers. It smelled of lemon polish, dried flowers, and underneath it all, the damp, earthy scent of the basement. I remembered that door. As a kid, it was the source of all my nightmares. Grandma had been fiercely protective of it, her kind eyes turning to flint whenever I got too close. "That's not a place for you, my love," she'd say. "Some doors are locked for a reason." Now the house was mine, and the door was my responsibility. The first few months were fine. I fixed the leaky roof, repainted the peeling trim. I avoided the basement. But the house was so quiet, the silence itself began to feel like a presence. I'd hear the floorboards creak upstairs when I knew I was alone. The distinct, faint aroma of my grandmother's rose perfume would sometimes drift through a room and then vanish. And then the sounds from the basement started. It began as a faint, almost musical tinkling, like wind chimes made of glass and bone. I told myself it was the plumbing. Then it became a dry, skittering rustle, like 1,000 insect legs moving in unison. I told myself it was mice. I became an expert in vinyl. One night, trying to sleep, I heard it clearly. A scratch. Not random. A slow, deliberate scratch. Drag. Scratch. Drag on the other side of the basement door. It was the sound of something sharp being drawn across the old wood from the inside. My blood turned to ice. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I held my breath, listening. The scratching stopped. And in the perfect, profound silence that followed, a voice seeped through the floorboards. It was thin, reedy, strained with effort, but unmistakably hers. "Katie?" It was my grandmother's voice. "Katie, please. It's so cold in here. Let me out, my darling. Just open the door." Tears sprang to my eyes. It was her. It sounded exactly like her. A wild, impossible hope surged in me. What if it was all a mistake? What if she was trapped somehow? The rational part of my brain screamed in protest, reminding me of the funeral, the casket, the dirt. But the sound of her voice, so pleading, so real, was a siren's call. For days I was torn in two. The voice called to me every night, growing more desperate, more pitiful.
It knew things only my grandmother could know. It reminded me of the secret recipe for her apple pie, the one she never wrote down. It sang the lullaby she used to sing to me when I was scared of thunderstorms. I started spending my days sitting on the top steps of the basement stairs, staring at that locked door. The padlock was ancient, crusted with rust. I found the key in her jewelry box, tied to a tag that read, in her elegant handwriting, "For the love of God, burn this. Do not use." The contradiction was maddening. The voice begged for freedom, the key warned of doom. One afternoon, driven to the brink, I shouted down the stairs, "How are you in there? I saw you buried." The voice fell silent for a long moment. When it returned, it was different. Less pleading, more cunning. "They buried what looked like me, child. They locked me in here long before that. Your grandfather, he was so afraid of being alone, he couldn't let me go." It was a horrifying, plausible lie. My grandfather had been a quiet, secretive man. I stood up, the key clutched so tightly in my palm it bit into my palm. I took a step down the stairs, then another. The air grew colder with each step. The smell of damp earth and roses became overwhelming. I stood before the door. The scratching started again, frantic now, eager. I could hear a dry, rattling breath from the other side. I lifted the heavy padlock, my hands trembling violently. The key hovered over the keyhole. "Grandma?" I whispered. "Yes, my love! Yes! Hurry!" the voice rasped. But in that final moment, I looked past the lock at the door itself, and I saw what I had never noticed before. The scratches, they weren't just on the inside. They were on the outside too. Deep, frantic gouges in the wood, as if someone, or something, had tried desperately to get back in, to lock whatever was inside back in its cage. The voice sensed my hesitation. It changed. The loving grandmother tone evaporated, replaced by a guttural, multi-layered snarl that sounded nothing like her. "Open the door!" I stumbled backward, dropping the key. I fled up the stairs and out of the house, never to return. I sold the house for a pittance to a developer. They bulldozed it last week. My friend sent me a picture of the empty lot. But in the photo, just before the wrecking ball hit, you can see it clearly. Through the collapsing basement wall, that one reinforced door, still standing, perfectly intact amidst the rubble. And if you zoom in, you can just make out a dark, shapeless silhouette pressed against the small barred window, watching. It's still in there. And now, the only thing that's left to protect the world from what's behind it is a rusted padlock, lying somewhere in the dirt, waiting for a new key or a new fool. I found my grandfather's old camera in his attic, a heavy, beautiful Leica. There was one roll of film still inside. When I developed it, the first 35 pictures were slices of his life from 1978, birthday parties, family picnics, a new car. But the 36th frame, the one that should not have existed, that one was different. It was a picture of me, taken last week, in my own apartment. And standing right behind me, with its hands on my shoulders, was a smiling man I've never seen before. The problem is, every time I look at the photograph, he's in a different place. My grandfather was a photographer, an artist. His attic was a time capsule, and the Leica M3 was its crown jewel. It was nestled in a worn leather case, and it felt like holding a piece of him. The weight of it was solid, reassuring. I'm a photographer too, but I work digitally. This was something else. This was magic. I held it up, the viewfinder a tiny clear window onto the world. The shutter made a sound like a sigh of satisfaction. Click, whir. I noticed the rewind knob turned slightly. There was film inside. A thrill like an archaeological discovery shot through me. I finished the roll over the next few days, taking pictures of my friends, my city apartment, the view from my fire escape. It felt like a tribute, closing a loop he had started over 40 years ago. When I got the developed roll back, The envelope felt heavier than it should. The photos were a time warp. My grandfather, young and vibrant, my mother as a little girl, and then my modern digital life, rendered in the beautiful gritty grain of old film. It was perfect until I reached the last photo. The photograph was of me. I was sitting at my desk, my back to the camera, editing photos on my laptop. It was taken from behind, from the corner of my bedroom near the door. I remembered that night. I had been alone. The hair on my arms stood up. And then I saw him. A man stood directly behind me, his hands resting lightly on my shoulders. He was tall, dressed in a dark, old-fashioned suit. His face was turned slightly towards the camera, and he was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator that has just cornered its prey. His eyes were dark, intense, and they seemed to look directly out of the photograph, right at me. I dropped the stack of pictures. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. This was impossible. A prank? But no one else had access to this film. I was the one who had loaded it into the developing tank myself in complete darkness. I picked the photo up again, my hands trembling. And that's when I noticed the first change. Before, his left hand had been on my left shoulder. Now his right hand was on my right shoulder. He had switched places. I blinked, thinking my eyes were tricking me. But no, his position had undeniably changed. I became obsessed with the photograph. I pinned it to my wall. I took pictures of it with my phone, trying to document the changes. And they kept happening. 1 hour he was simply standing behind me. The next, his head was tilted, his smile a little wider. The next, one of his hands was lifted, a single long finger pointing at the back of my head. In another, his mouth was open, as if he were whispering something into my ear. The grain of the film seemed to writhe around him, a storm of static that only he inhabited. The changes were no longer just in the photo. I started to feel them in the apartment. A cold spot would form right where he was standing in the picture. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the sensation of a weight depressing the mattress beside me. The faint, sweet smell of old film and developing chemicals began to linger in the air, a smell that was now tainted with something metallic, like ozone before a storm. I took the photo down, locked it in a metal box. It didn't matter. I could still feel his presence, a pressure at the edge of my vision. I'd catch a glimpse of a dark suit in the reflection of my monitor, but when I turned, nothing was there. The click whir of the Leica would sometimes echo from a room I'd just left, even though the camera was sitting, inert, on my shelf. Last night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see. I unlocked the metal box and pulled out the photograph. I screamed. The image had changed completely. It was no longer a picture of me at my desk. It was a picture of me sleeping in my bed, taken from the foot of it. The man was no longer just standing behind me. He was in the bed with me, lying beside me, his face pressed close to mine, his dark eyes wide open and staring directly into the lens. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of serene, possessive triumph. I threw the photo across the room and backed into a corner sobbing. I spent the rest of the night with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife, watching the bedroom door. This morning, there is a new development. The photograph is gone from where I threw it. I've turned the apartment upside down. It's vanished. But the Leica is on my desk. And the rewind knob. It's turned. It's full again. There's a new roll of film inside. I can feel it. He's finished with that picture. He's ready to take a new one. And I know, with a certainty that chills my soul, that I won't be the one clicking the shutter this time. The camera has a new photographer.
and I have a feeling I'm about to become the final, permanent subject in his collection.